Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Al-Walid bin Talal Seminar in Islamic Studies. My name is Harry Buster Mudjan. I'm the Executive Director of the Al-Walid bin Talal Islamic Studies program here at Harvard University. And today I am very proud to introduce our guest, Dr. Karl Sharif El-Tobgui, who is an Associate Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies and the Director of the Arabic Language Program at Brandeis University. Professor El-Tobgui is an expert in the field of Islamic thought with a concentration on theology, law, and jurisprudence. His scholarship focuses on questions concerning the relationship between reason and revelation in the Islamic tradition and has published on the manifestations of this tension in the fields of classical Islamic jurisprudence and Quranic exegesis. Dr. El-Tobghi's first monograph, Ibn Taymiyyah on Reason and Revelation, published in 2020 by Brill, is an extensive study of Ibn Taymiyyah's 10-volume magnum opus, Dar al-Taharud al-Aql wal-Naql, or Refutation of Contradiction Between Reason and Revelation, which is also the subject of Professor El-Tobghi's seminar today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. El-Tobgui. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harry, for that very gracious introduction. I am happy to be here today. I thank you and Mariam Hazmi also for the invitation. And I thank everyone who has joined today. I'm honored by your presence. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have okay. All right, so before I get started, let me just say a little bit about where I'm coming from. So I've been fascinated for a long time about with questions related to reason and revelation in a general sense, how human reason interacts with divine revelation, where the boundaries are between the two, what the relationship is supposed to be, the ideal relationship between the two, how that's viewed by different schools of thought, particularly within the Islamic tradition. I have looked at various aspects of this, obviously, tension, because there can be, one can feel that there's a tension between what revelation says or seems to be saying and what the dictates of reason seem to be. And so I've looked at different aspects of this tension in usul al-fiqh. I've also looked at it in tafsir. I've looked at it also more recently in the realm of theology and philosophy proper, which formed the topic first of my dissertation and then my first monograph, where I looked at Ibn Taymiyyah, who is a late medieval sort of pivotal Muslim thinker who dies, as you can see here, in the year 1328 or 728 of the Hijrah. He comes on the heels of what is normally referred to in at least Western literature as the kind of golden age of Islam. So he's sort of slightly post-classical, of course, these periodizations can be questioned and interrogated, but just to use a common trope, he's sort of a somewhat post-classical thinker. And Ibn Taymiyyah is known for being, or has still to this day, although many studies have come out in the last decade or two that have corrected this image, he is still seen as being sort of this crass kind of literalist, sort of this fundamentalist scholar, if we can use that term, who repudiates the tradition that came before him, the theological tradition, the philosophical tradition, and sort of has this mantra back to the Quran and the Sunnah, which he does have that mantra, but his thought is actually a lot more interesting and a lot more sophisticated than he has traditionally been given credit for. I looked for my work at his magnum opus, the work that is considered his magnum opus, which is called Dar Taharud al-Aql wal-Naql, or the refutation or averting of the contradiction of reason and revelation. This is a 10-volume work. It was first published in a full edition in 1979. There are 10 volumes, about 4,000 pages, a little bit more, and then an 11th volume with indexes. So it's a very expansive work. And in it, Ibn Taymiyyah basically tries to make or to prove the contention, his contention, that there is no actual conflict, bona fide conflict between true human reason and authentic revelation. Obviously, in his case, he's referring here to the Quran and the verified Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. and that any perceived conflict between the two either results from a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of revelation, or, and this is more pertinent for my project, a sort of misconstrual or misappropriation of reason. So, so he spends a lot of this work, this 10-volume work, the Taharud, he spends a lot of the work attempting to sort of refute and interrogate the terms in which reason has been conceived of up until his day. And he tries to dismantle what sort of passed for reason, not only among the falasifa, the Muslim philosophers, but also among the theologians, mostly the Ash'ari theologians, the mutakallimun, and to sort of rebuild reason on new foundations, which he holds to be both closer to the sort of true inborn nature of reason that people are born with, as well as closer to revelation, understood sort of in a straightforward, plain sense manner, the way he claims the early community, the Salaf, understood it, without attempts to reinterpret it in order to match or the dictates of what is thought to be reason, as later schools argue. And so this is sort of his major project. The other part of the project, which we'll be spending some time on, is the very relationship between reason and revelation, and this notion of a conflict and what to do about the conflict, and what the theologians, the mutakallimun, had prescribed in case of a conflict. He also sort of rejects the model that they had put forward and tries to overcome the sort of the binary, the reason revelation binary altogether, and again to sort of propose that there is a fundamental harmony between the two sources, as long as each one is understood and conceived of properly. So as I said, it's the topic itself that really interests me the most. Why did I choose to work on Ibn Taymiyyah? You know, a long time ago, when I was up at McGill studying with Professor Wael Halak, I was sitting in his office one day and looked up, he was on the phone, and I saw this 10-volume work, you know, with the beautiful Arabic writing, and I read the title, Taharud al-Aql wal-Naql, and I saw it was by Ibn Taymiyyah. I didn't know much about Ibn Taymiyyah at the time, but the title intrigued me because the topic intrigued me. And knowing that Ibn Taymiyyah was sort of a later figure and that he had written 10 volumes, I figured, well, there must be something interesting in there since he's coming so late and responding to sort of the whole classical tradition before him. So when Professor Halak got off the phone, I said, well, what is that up there? He said, oh, that's Ibn Taymiyyah's work. I said, has anyone, you know, studied that before? And he said, no. And I said, well, why not? It looks very interesting. And he said, well, who's going to read all of that? Right? It's this 10-volume. And stupidly, I said, oh, you know, I'll do that. So I actually bought his copy off of him, and you know, and then sort of fell into a dark hole, trying to make my way through that and sum it up in the form of a book. Anyone who's read Ibn Taymiyyah knows that, unlike Al-Ghazali and a number of other figures, he does not write in a very systematic way. I think he actually is a very clear thinker. I think he's also very consistent, from what I can tell, having spent a number of years with him. He's very, very consistent. A lot of thinkers, there's the early and then the later, or different works, you can't really figure out how they fit together. But Ibn Taymiyyah seems to be very consistent. On the other hand, his writing style is not at all like, again, Al-Ghazali is the consummate, you know, هذا الفصل فيه مباحث. You know, this chapter has 5 sections, section 1, section 2, section 3, and it's all very, very easily, you know, very clearly delineated and organized. Ibn Taymiyyah just kind of writes. He lived at a turbulent time. He lived at a time when the Mongol sort of hordes invading the Near East were impinging on the gates of Syria, where he was not born, but you know, his family actually fled the Mongol invasions into Damascus. He grew up in Damascus. He spent some time, a good portion of his life in Damascus, and also a number of years in Egypt, mostly in Cairo. He had a tumultuous life with the kind of external threat of the Mongol imposition. He actually fought the Mongols on more than one occasion on the battlefield. He also had a turbulent relationship with other members of the scholarly community of his time, because he was seen as being quite iconoclastic. He was put in jail a number of times for certain of his views, which were seen to be unacceptable. There was also some political innuendo that plays into this, you know, whole thing, which I deal with all in chapter 2 of my book. But his writing style very much very much mirrors the turbulence of his times and the turbulence of his life. So he just kind of goes in and writes and refutes and answers this group and this argument and that argument. And he doesn't really tell you what he's doing in terms of his underlying notions, his underlying what I call the philosophy of Ibn Taymiyyah. I'm not sure he would appreciate having a quote unquote philosophy attributed to him, since he was quite critical of the philosophers, but I mean philosophy in the broad sense of his underlying assumptions, his his methodology and so forth. So really my goal in the work was to read the 10 volumes, which I did sort of line by line, and to kind of draw out what his underlying principles are, what his underlying kind of implicit philosophy is, and what it looks like if we try to put it all on paper. Of course, I don't deal with everything he deals in there, because a lot of it is, quoting previous scholars, refuting them, using them against one another and so forth. And so that's kind of the woods and the weeds. But what I try to do is sort of take a step back and get a picture of the deeper structure. So without further ado, wait a minute. Okay. So my study on this came out actually just last January, by Brill, Ibn Taymiyyah, Reason and Revelation, a study of Taharud al-Aql wal-Naql, again, which we can translate as the refutation or averting of the contradiction of reason and revelation. This has been published open access, so you do not need to spend the money for the notoriously expensive Brill books. You can actually just go to their website and download the entire text for free. Either the whole text or chapter by chapter. It's quite versatile. So I invite people to check that out at will. Okay, so the major themes of the Taharud al-Aql wal-Naql are first Ibn Taymiyyah's refutation of the universal rule, al-Qanun al-Kulli, of the Mutakallimun. And we'll talk about what this is. It's also sometimes called al-Qanun al-Kulli lit-Ta'wil, which means a universal rule of interpretation. And Ibn Taymiyyah spends about, I would say out of the 10 volumes, probably about 2 volumes, if you put it all together, probably about 2 volumes refuting just the logical structure of this rule, which we will look at in some detail here. He puts forth, well, he says he's going to put forth 44 arguments against this rule, and he does put forth about, I've identified about 38 of those are sort of discrete arguments that are directed against the rule itself. The other 6 quote unquote arguments are really extended discourses on a number of substantive issues where he gets involved in discussions on infinity, on causality, and all these other things, which are not really directed at the law itself, the law of interpretation of the theologians, but more some of the substantive issues that were at play during his time and before his time. So in my book, chapter 1 is sort of a broad sweep of reason and revelation and the relationship between them in Islamic thought up until Ibn Taymiyyah's time in the 7th and 8th Islamic centuries. Chapter 2 is basically his biography, his works, and how he also viewed the intellectual history that he inherited. And then chapters 3, 4, and 5 and 6 are basically what you see here. So chapter 3 is dedicated to this, his attack on the universal rule and the structure he tries to put in its place. And then chapter 4 looks at his theory of language, which is quite interesting in his hermeneutical principles. Chapter 5 looks at the ontological and epistemological reforms that he tries to introduce in order to deal with the contradiction or perceived contradiction between reason and revelation. And then chapter 6, which is shorter and doubles as a conclusion, kind of puts it all together and tries to apply his methodology to one of the questions that is of most concern to him, which was the question of the divine attributes and the degree to which these should be understood in a straightforward sense or else reinterpreted in a kind of metaphorical sense. This was a burning issue for a number of centuries in Islamic thought, and this was very close to Ibn Taymiyyah's heart, this particular issue. And so this is really his primary concern. But what I've tried to do is abstract his principles, and then in the last chapter show how those abstract principles apply to this very real concern that he is sort of dealing with throughout the work. Okay, so his general contention is, and I try to sort of gather it together in what I have named the Taimian pyramid. He says that sound reason and authentic revelation, so what he calls al-aql al-sarih, pure reason, sound reason, and al-naql al-sahih, which is authentic revelation. So of course in Arabic it rhymes, which is very characteristic and also very convenient. Al-aql al-sarih wa al-naql al-sahih, that these two, when each one is properly understood, they are like this point at the top of this pyramid. There's unicity between them, clarity, and they both provide certainty or yaqeen, and they are in perfect agreement with each other. Now, of course, revelation might tell us things that reason cannot know on its own, and it might tell us things that go beyond reason. So he's not reducing what revelation can tell us to the purely rational. In fact, he would blame the Mu'tazilites for the so-called rationalists for having tried to over-rationalize revelation in that sense. But he would say that revelation doesn't tell us anything that contradicts reason. So it can tell us what goes beyond reason, but nothing that it tells us actually contradicts sound rational principles. And then he says, the further you move away from a proper apprehension of reason and start to view reason in specious ways, or start viewing reason on the backdrop of ontological commitments or metaphysical commitments that, for example, were imported by through Greek philosophy, which the philosophers, but also many of the mutakallimun, in his view, many of the theologians also sort of took on board without realizing that they were doing that. He says the more you move away from pure reason, and the more you move away from a kind of straightforward reading of authentic revelation, the more the two start to diverge, right? So he says the Ash'aris, right, the Ash'ari school, which is the kind of the main school of rationalistic theology in Islam, the Mutakallimun, they kind of move a little bit away from true reason, and therefore also have to start reinterpreting scripture in a metaphorical sense in order for it to match their kind of faulty view of reason. If you go to the Mu'tazila, who are kind of lie further out in terms of their adherence to revelation and to the tradition of the early community, or the Salaf, which also is a very important concept for Ibn Taymiyyah, they are even further away from him in terms of their apprehension of reason, and also more kind of profligate, I don't want to say liberal, but more profligate in their reinterpretation of scripture. And then the further you go down, you get to the philosophers proper, and he says they're even further out in terms of reason and their kind of specious metaphysical pre-commitments, and therefore have to make an even more extreme and more categorical reinterpretation or allegorization or of scripture or metaphorical interpretation, so that they can bring that into harmony with reason. And so if you go to the bottom of the pyramid, eventually you get to what he calls sophistry in rational terms, and pure kind of allegorization in terms of revelation, where nothing in scripture kind of means what it seems to mean. Everything has an internal meaning which contradicts its external sort of plain sense meaning that you would gather just from reading the text, and so forth. And similarly, when it comes to your rational principles, you fall into contradiction, you fall into almost a sense of nihilism. So this is kind of, so this is the Taimian pyramid, and his goal in the Taharud, this work, this 10-volume work, is to sort of make good the case, or prove the case, that sound reason and authentic revelation actually do kind of coincide in a very fundamental sense, and that you don't have to sacrifice one for the other, as long as each one is understood properly. Okay, so what is this universal law that we keep talking about? I'm sorry that there's so much text on this particular slide. The very first page of the Taharud, Ibn Taymiyyah says, it is said, and then he quotes this universal law, which is very close to the formulation of it by Fakhruddin al-Razi, who dies 1209, 606 of the Hijrah, 1209 of the Common Era. So Fakhruddin al-Razi dies just about 50 years before Ibn Taymiyyah is born. And he was the last and certainly one of the greatest Ash'ari theologians before Ibn Taymiyyah. I mean, obviously the school lives on beyond Ibn Taymiyyah and also produces a number of major later figures, but al-Razi was sort of the most mature and kind of formidable representative and articulator of the Ash'ari school of theology before Ibn Taymiyyah birth. And so Ibn Taymiyyah cites Ar-Razi's, or a paraphrase of Ar-Razi's formulation of the universal law, and then he says this is invalid from a number of angles, and then he sort of sets off, I mean, ostensibly the entire 10 volumes is just to refute this universal law, but as I explained before, there's actually a lot more in there than just the attack on the law. So what does the law say? We can read it together. So again, these are not Ar-Razi's exact words, but it's sort of a close paraphrase. And Ar-Razi is not the only one who to articulate this law. Al-Ghazali had articulated it before him, but you know, the formulation becomes more specific and more elaborate a little bit as we go on. So basically, if scriptural and rational indications, or revelation and reason, or the obvious outward meaning of the revealed texts in the definitive conclusions of rational thought, or other ways of phrasing it, are in conflict, so reason and revelation, if they're in conflict, then either there are four ways that we can react to this conflict between them. Either they can both be accepted, and we're talking about an actual contradiction where, you know, they can't both be true at the same time. So either they must both be accepted, which is impossible, as this would violate the law of non-contradiction, claiming both P and not P. Two, they must both be rejected, which is also impossible, as this would violate the law of the excluded middle, claiming neither P nor not P. Again, we're talking about contradictions and, you know, sort of diametric opposites. Or three, precedence must be given to revelation and reason sort of dismissed, which is impossible, the law says, because it is revelation because revelation is grounded in reason, meaning that our knowledge of the authenticity of revelation is based in reason, such that if we were to give priority to revelation over reason, this would amount to a rejection of both reason and, by extension, revelation, which it grounds. In other words, if it's only through reason that we can know that revelation is true to begin with, then if we start second-guessing reason when it conflicts with revelation, then we're really undermining the very basis by which we know revelation. And so we're undermining both of them together. And so therefore, the universal law says, therefore we must, number four, the kind of fourth possibility, give precedence to reason over revelation, right? So when the two conflict, you have to give precedence to the rational conclusion. And then where scripture is concerned, you either have to reinterpret it figuratively in order to accord with reason. This is a process called ta'wil, or kind of figurative reinterpretation. Or, and this is sort of a safer way, you simply negate the apparent meaning of scripture. Okay, well, we know it can't mean what it seems to be saying, but we refrain from assigning to it a definite particular metaphorical meaning for fear that we might sort of hypothesize an incorrect meaning and therefore foist onto scripture something which is actually not saying. And so we just kind of remain agnostic, so to speak, as to the meaning, while negating the overt sense of it. Okay, so again, Ibn Taymiyyah cites this on the very first page and then says, this is invalid, هذا باطل من وجوه, you know, from a number of different angles, of which there are ostensibly 44, but as I said, more like 38 or so, which I summarize and kind of categorize in chapter 3. So what are the main moves that he makes against the universal law? So, and we'll look at these one by one. The first notion that we saw in it is this notion of reason grounding our knowledge of revelation. So Ibn Taymiyyah sort of interrogates, what does it mean for reason to ground our knowledge of revelation? And is reason's grounding of our knowledge of revelation such that any kind of gainsaying of reason would necessarily undermine our confidence in the truth of revelation, which is based on rational considerations. So that's number one. And again, we'll unpack this a little bit. Then he kind of brings forth a different scheme that he wants to impose, which is that it's not reason versus revelation, but it's knowledge, meaning definitive, certain knowledge, versus that which is merely conjectural or suppositional. And so the real binary for him is not reason on one hand and revelation on the other, but it's true knowledge on one hand, or kind of definitive knowledge on one hand, and merely conjectural knowledge on the other, which is a lower epistemic grade. And again, he's going to make the argument that when it comes to true knowledge or certain knowledge, reason and revelation actually agree there, but that the real binary is one between knowledge and conjecture, not between reason and revelation. And then the third move that he makes, which is novel in his thought, as far as I can tell, I don't believe anyone articulated it this particular way before. The traditional binary has been, there's a binary that's made between scriptural and rational. So you have the scriptural sciences in Islam and the rational sciences, aqli and naqli, or aqli and shar'i. So aqli is rational, and shar'i is that which is derived from the texts. So again, it's pitting sort of the rational against the revelational. And Ibn Taymiyyah also says, no, this is not the right binary to have. The real binary is not shar'i, meaning revelational, versus aqli, meaning rational. It's shar'i, meaning scripturally validated, versus bid'i, which is scripturally innovated. And again, he brings reason into the scripturally validated. He gives reason a place within revelation itself, and therefore kind of brings authentic reason, or his notion of authentic reason, under the umbrella of what is scripturally validated. So scripturally validated includes both authentic scriptural text as well as valid reason. And those are kind of put or faced off against that which is scripturally innovated, which would be inauthentically transmitted texts, or specious reason, or just bad reason, incorrect reason, or not pure reason. So these are kind of the three main moves that he tries to make against the universal law. And he does so again by putting forth around 38 discrete arguments against the law itself. The law, as we've seen it, just the structural and kind of logical entailments of it, without going into any substantive questions that were being debated either at his time or before, right? He's just trying to undermine the law itself. So if we look at these one by one, very briefly, on reason grounding revelation, what does it mean for reason to ground revelation? Essentially, it means that a claim to revelation is made, in this case by the Prophet Muhammad to his contemporaries, and then to everyone who comes after them, because they hear of his claim to prophethood. They come in contact with the alleged revelation that he brought. They also have knowledge that's been transmitted about his character, the circumstance of his life, and so forth. And so the idea is that when we look at the claim being made, and we look at the circumstances in which the claim is being made, and we look at the revelation itself, all of these allow us to make basically a rational judgment. I mean, of course, it's not always that simple, but the idea is that you're not just believing in something blindly, but you assess the claim being made, and you end up making a judgment that is largely a rationally based judgment that, yes, this is a true message. This person really was a prophet, as he claimed to be. The message that he brought, the Quran, really is, a revelation from God. It's not something he just made up and so forth. So the idea is that because it is seen that the assent to revelation is essentially a rational assent on some level, the idea is that if reason and revelation then conflict on some particular point. Now, let me give an example to make it clearer. And I also talk about this in the beginning of the book. The philosophers, I'm not talking about the theologians, but the philosophers famously say, particularly Ibn Sina, and this is something Al-Ghazali critiques him for in his Tahafut al-Falasifa, or the incoherence of the philosophers. The claim is made that God, for example, cannot know particulars. This is taken from an Aristotelian framework where you have, a genus, you have species, and they have individuals. And so the idea is that God can know, for example, the essence of a dog or a tree, but he doesn't know individual trees, because individual trees are instantiated things in this world. They come into being, they go out of being, and they change like all things in this world. And if God were said to know individual things in the world that change, then this would imply a change in his knowledge, because his knowledge is of each thing as it exists. And if it's changing all the time, then God's knowledge is changing. And because God is God, he must be perfectly simple, perfectly unchangeable, completely static in a sense, and therefore there cannot be any change in his knowledge. Otherwise, it would compromise sort of his divinity. And so this is meant to be a rational conclusion that the philosophers have arrived at based on certain suppositions, metaphysical and ontological assumptions that they're operating on. And therefore they say, God cannot therefore know particular things, but only the essences of things, because essences are abstract. So the essence, what a tree is essentially, that's something that doesn't change. So God can know that, but he just can't know individual trees because that knowledge would introduce change in his knowledge. Of course, the implication of this is that God can also not, he can know mankind as a universal, but cannot know individual human beings. What does this mean for the religious life? What does this mean for the message of the Quran if it's true that God actually doesn't know individual people? Why worship him? Why pray, for example? Why supplicate? And so Ibn Taymiyyah often, and the theologians in general, had a big problem with these kinds of contentions. Now, to rephrase this, or to kind of put this in the mold of reason versus revelation, where's the conflict? So reason ostensibly tells us that God cannot know particulars, but then the Quran says very clearly in one verse, for example, many verses would be relevant here, but one, وَمَا تَسْقُطُ مِنْ وَرَقَةٍ إِلَّا يَعْلَمُهَا. Not a single leaf falls except that he knows it. So the Quran is very clearly stating in no uncertain terms that not a single leaf, I mean, forget about a human being, but not even a single leaf on a tree, of which there are quadrillions, at any given moment, not a single leaf falls except that God knows it. And the philosophers say, well, he can't know any particulars at all. And so clearly there's a clash here, right? And so the idea is, well, what do we do? Either we say, well, reason is wrong and revelation is right because it comes from God, so that can't be wrong. So we go with revelation and we say, well, reason is wrong. But then the idea is, well, if reason's wrong, how can you trust reason when reason has led you? I mean, how can you trust reason's recommendation to you of the authenticity of revelation, right? That essentially rational judgment you made in favor of revelation, how can you trust reason on that score if you're going to now start to question reason on the question of whether God can know particulars? That's the thrust of the universal law. So the idea is we can't touch reason, because if we touch reason and undermine it in any way, we're going to be undermining our confidence in revelation, and they're both going to fall together, right? So the idea is we say, okay, well, the Quran, it can't really mean this. This is just metaphorical. In the case of the philosophers, this is just language to appeal to the common people, to get them to think that, yeah, God really does sort of know us individually. It's more palpable for them. The real truth of the matter is too abstract. It would destroy their kind of real religious life, which would go against the purposes of sending revelation. So there's all these ways that you can kind of explain revelation away, but the idea is that the real truth lies with reason. So Ibn Taymiyyah says that this is too categorical, and that reason is not all one thing, just like revelation is not all one thing. So reason has many different types of conclusions it can come to. It has different processes of inference that it uses. It operates on different assumptions in different fields. I'm just paraphrasing very generally. And so you have to look at each individual thing that is being claimed in the name of reason individually, and examine all of its assumptions and all of its entailments, and then pass judgment on each individual thing, and not on reason altogether against revelation altogether. So he tries to break down, this category of just reason being all one thing, with respect to which we can just have one attitude of either rejection or acceptance, or prioritizing it over revelation or revelation over it. He says this is not realistic, right? Reason is many things, and reason could be correct in one thing and it could be incorrect in another thing. And it could be perfectly correct in its judgments on the basis of which you have accepted revelation, but nevertheless be wrong in 6 other things. And just because it's wrong on these other things doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong in this thing. So he says, at most, we only need to be able to verify that reason has not gone astray in those judgments on the basis of which it has recommended to us the truth of revelation, right? The truthfulness of the Prophet Muhammad, and so on and so forth, right? As long as we're sure that we can trust its deliverances there, then that's all we need. That's all we need. And that's the only part of reason that the truth of revelation is resting on. The truth of revelation, or our knowledge of the truth of revelation, is not resting on all of reason or everything reason might say, but very specifically only on those judgments that relate to the question of the truth of revelation, right? So what he wants to do is just to say reason needs to be broken down. Revelation also needs to be broken down, because what is revelation? It consists of different kinds of texts. So there's the Quran, obviously, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, passed down in a sort of mass transmitted manner, known as tawatur formally, and so therefore considered to be completely authentic and sort of firmly, rigorously authenticated in terms of its textual transmission. But then you have other aspects of revelation, such as the hadith texts, which are texts that relate the words of the Prophet Muhammad, right? Not the words that he were revealed to him and that he then transmitted to his companions, but his own words, and also reports about his actions and so on and so forth. And these are passed down usually in a much less kind of massive, mass transmitted fashion than the Quran itself. And so different hadith reports have different scales of epistemic quality. And so he says, similarly, reason is, revelation is not all one thing. And you might have a rational conclusion that's actually very strong, and it might contradict a text from revelation, like a hadith text, that is kind of is more questionable in terms of its authenticity. And in that case, and we'll see this in a second in a chart, in that case, you simply prioritize, this kind of goes on to the next point, you prioritize what has the stronger epistemic standing on the question at issue, not, again, revelation as just one block or reason as one block. So his first move is to basically break down these categories of reason and revelation, and to say reason is not all one thing, revelation is not all one thing. You have to look at what is being claimed specifically in each case of conflict and look at it individually and not in terms of just these block categories. And in fact, he actually brings his, in a sense, major rival, Ar-Razi, Fakhruddin Ar-Razi. He brings a quote from Ar-Razi to prove his own point. And he says, look, even Ar-Razi admits this. And so the quote from Ar-Razi, which, Ibn Taymiyyah could have said this himself. In fact, he does say it himself. Ar-Razi says, it has been established that knowledge of the principles, the usul, upon the validity of which our knowledge of the authenticity of the messengership of Muhammad, may God bless him and grant him peace, depends. So again, a long sentence. It has been established that knowledge of the principles upon the validity of which our knowledge of basically the authenticity of revelation depends, is patent and evident knowledge. These principles have only been discussed at length in order to remove the doubts raised by those who would declare them false. Otherwise, it is firmly established that the foundations of Islam are patent and clear, and furthermore, that the proofs establishing them are mentioned in a comprehensive manner in the Book of God, meaning the Quran, and are free of anything erroneously imagined to oppose them, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah says, yes, exactly, that's exactly right. But Ibn Taymiyyah would say it doesn't apply as it does for Razi only to the kind of the principles and the main foundations, but also to the details, so to speak. So this is just to show any kind of briefly in Razi's words, what Ibn Taymiyyah is trying to establish, but in a more comprehensive manner, and with respect to everything Revelation says, and not just the main principles that undergird it. Okay, the second thing, and I've already kind of alluded to this, is that it is that he puts forth a new binary, which is knowledge versus conjecture, or certainty versus conjecture. So, and we'll see the Arabic terms for this in a second. Conclusiveness is what counts, or it's the epistemic quality of a particular proof or a particular source of knowledge that matters, not the source itself. And so what do we mean by this? So he says, okay, a rational proof or a rational argument, let's put it that way, a dalil aqli, can be either conclusive or it can be inconclusive. Qat'i means conclusive, absolutely 100% certain. And he gives the example, for example, a syllogism, a deductive syllogism, where the premises are absolutely certain, leads to an absolutely certain conclusion. Now, he has a lot of critiques against logic, but the actual sort of form and the formal validity of the syllogism, he does not question. He questions how sure we can be about the premises, especially the major premise. But given if we do have certain premises, then the conclusion follows if we have followed with certainty, if we have followed proper reasoning. So anyway, so we can have certain conclusions of reason, also beyond the syllogism, just, certain inborn rational intuitions that we can hold to be true in a sort of conclusive sense. There are other conclusions that reason might come to that are inconclusive. They might be strongly grounded. It might be reasonable for us to believe them if there's no countervailing evidence from revelation or from anything else, but nevertheless, they are dhanni or inconclusive rather than conclusive. So he says, rational proofs admit of being both conclusive and inconclusive. Similarly, scriptural proofs or, scriptural texts, we could say, or arguments based on scripture, so dalil naqli, also admit of being conclusive and inconclusive. So for a scriptural proof or a scriptural proof text to be conclusive, it has to be conclusive in two respects. Number one, the authenticity of it as a text of scripture, as a text of revelation, has to be beyond any doubt, okay? So again, it has to be a text that has been transmitted, a mass transmission. I mean, we can't really go into the whole theory behind this, theory of mass transmission and why and how that leads to kind of certainty about the integrity of historical texts. But it has to be one of the texts that has been transmitted in that type of way, which includes all of the Quran, the entire Quranic text, as well as some hadith, a sort of limited number of hadith. And also the signification of the text must be univocal and conclusive. So I might have a verse of the Quran. One could say, okay, I have no doubt that this is sort of authentic revelation if I accept the Quran as revelation. But the verse is ambiguous. The language and the vocabulary and the syntax and the context allow for, several plausible meanings. And so I cannot claim definitiveness for any given interpretation if there are several interpretations that are plausible. If, however, the verse is univocal, then we can say that, what it states univocally, we can also know with certainty to be the import of the verse. So it's only when a scriptural text is conclusive, both in terms of its textual authenticity, as well as univocal in terms of its signification, that we can hold that, okay, X proposition transmitted or affirmed by revelation is known conclusively. If either of these two considerations is dhanni or inconclusive, so if we're dealing with a text like a hadith text, which falls short of this kind of mass transmission, so although we can be very, quite confident of its authenticity, authentic kind of ascription to the Prophet Muhammad, we can't be absolutely 100% sure. Or if the signification of the text is less than conclusive, then we have a revelational statement that is inconclusive and less than completely conclusive. So again, I think it's interesting here that he's not saying, well, you have reason on one side and revelation on the other. Each one, both reason and revelation, are various, and the epistemic quality, if we can put it that way, the epistemic grade of the deliverances of each one also varies. And so reason sometimes can provide us with definitive knowledge, sometimes non-definitive, and revelation the same. And because of this, what really counts is not the source of a piece of knowledge, but rather how conclusive we have that knowledge. And so to put this in the form of this chart, you could have reason and revelation both addressing one and the same topic, where there might be thought to be a conflict. And so he says, what you do is you kind of look at the quality of your proofs. So if we look here, you have on the top the rational proof, can be either conclusive or inconclusive, and on the side, the left side here, you have the scriptural proof, can also be conclusive or inconclusive. So if you are dealing with a conclusive rational proof and a conclusive scriptural proof, then you're basically at the top of that taimian pyramid that we talked about in the beginning. And the result of that is that both revelation and reason attest conclusively to one and the same fact, okay? And they can't conflict here, because if they're both conclusively true, then it means that they're both corresponding to reality as it is. And so it's not really conceivable that they could actually authentically conflict if they're both actually conclusive and definitive on the point in question, okay? If you have, now if we go to the top right box here, you have a an inconclusive rational proof on an issue that you, next to a conclusive scriptural proof, then the conclusive scriptural proof takes precedence over the inconclusive rational proof, right? Conversely, if you have down on the lower left-hand corner, if you have on a given topic, an inconclusive scriptural proof or statement, but you have a conclusive rational proof, then here it's the conclusive rational proof that takes precedence over the inconclusive scriptural proof. So again, he's not categorically preferring reason over revelation if the two conflict, or revelation over reason. He says, look at which one is stronger. If one of them is conclusive and the other one is inconclusive, then you go with the conclusive, you go with conclusiveness over inconclusiveness. And if it's the rational proof that's conclusive and the scriptural proof that's inconclusive, great, go with reason because it's conclusive on the point in question. If it's the opposite, then go with scripture, not because it's scripture, but because it's conclusive, right? And then the last box, which is the lower right, if you have an inconclusive rational proof and an inconclusive scriptural proof. It's easy to decide. If I have a conclusive proof and an inconclusive, it's easy to sort of decide, okay, well, obviously I go with the conclusive. But if they're both inconclusive, then you simply have to weigh them off against each other. And the stronger of the two proofs takes precedence over the weaker. And again, in some cases it might be that the rational proof is stronger, so you would go with that, or the scriptural proof might be stronger, and so you would go with that. But his point is that it's the strength of the proof itself that should guide our prioritizing of one over the other, not the mere fact that it originates either in reason or in revelation. Okay. All right, and then the last move that he makes, the last sort of major move that he makes against the universal law, is that he says, again, the traditional binary before his time was scriptural versus rational. So shar'i, or revelational, versus aqli. So you have the shara, revelation, and reason. And he says, this is not correct. It's not shar'i versus aqli, or revelational versus rational. It's shar'i versus bid'i, which means revelational versus innovative. And I, translated this here as scripturally validated versus scripturally innovated, because the point he's trying to make is that in the mainstream classification before his time, the binary is, as I said, you have either scriptural proof or rational proof. That's the binary that you're looking at, right? That's a mainstream classification of proofs as being scriptural versus rational. His scheme looks something like this. So he says it's not scriptural versus rational, it's scripturally validated, right, versus scripturally innovated. So dalil shar'i here on the left, dalil bid'i on the right. Now, the scripturally validated proof in the traditional schema, scriptural just means something which comes from scripture, so a text of the Quran or a text of the Hadith, and rational is anything derived from reason. In Ibn Taymiyyah's schema, right, it's not scriptural in the sense of coming from scripture only, it's that which scripture approves of and validates. Now, what does scripture approve of and validate? Well, it approves of here on the, so I don't know if you can see my cursor. You can, okay, all right. So what I'm circling here with my cursor on the left-hand side, shar'i aqli, scripturally validated rational proofs. So he says that the Quran, in fact, is full of arguments. So of course, it just, some things it just states kind of categorically, but on many occasions, it coaxes its reader. Do they not think? Do they not reflect? They ask you, O Prophet, meaning the disbelievers at his time, the Meccans and so forth, the polytheists, they ask you X, Y, and Z. Tell them this. Do they not consider that? Well, what if this were the case? Then that would be the case, right? So he says the Quran itself uses arguments and exhibits human reasoning and how we're supposed to use our reasoning in order to arrive at truth in general, and truth about the, about religion and sort of the meaning of life and so on and so forth in particular. So revelation, Ibn Taymiyyah says, it validates the use of reason, it authorizes the use of reason, it also illustrates the use of reason, valid uses of reason. So any valid use of reason, right, which if we go down here now, what are the valid uses of reason that scripture itself validates and approves of and encourages? Valid proofs, meaning valid rational arguments and syllogisms. Okay, again, we can't go into the details of this, but the idea is that reason itself is given a place for Ibn Taymiyyah within revelation itself and is brought under the umbrella of what is scripturally validated. So that's one type of scripturally validated proof, is a scripturally validated rational proof. So it's shari aqli. The other type is shari sam'i, which means a scripturally validated revelational proof, right? And this is the traditional category of the revelational, meaning the texts of revelation themselves, the Quran, and the authentic prophetic hadith. So in a sense, you could say this shari aqli versus shari sam'i. This is kind of the traditional dichotomy, and he kind of grabs both of them and he puts them under the larger category of scripturally validated. And scripturally validated is the opposite of that is not rational, but rather innovated. And innovated is, you know, a term that has, you know, very old in Islamic discourse. Bid'ah means to innovate something in the religion, to add something to it which is not originally part of it. It's meant as a term of abuse. Bid'ah is something that's bad, and bid'ah is something that Ibn Taymiyyah talked a lot about and was very concerned about in his time. And so when he uses this, you know, he's using it with particular force as well. So a dalil bid'i is an innovated proof, meaning innovated bad, right? Not innovation like in the modern sense, oh, that's an innovation, you're supposed to be innovative, creative. For him, this is a term of opprobrium. And so you have bid'i aqli, so innovated rational, meaning invalid rational, would be invalid proofs, invalid syllogisms, invalid rational arguments based on specious metaphysical and ontological assumptions such as those of the philosophers, which led them to believe that, you know, God's knowledge of individuals would lead to a change in his knowledge, which would be an imperfection in the divine being, so on and so forth. All of this would fall for him under, you know, the kind of innovated rationality. This is not pure God-given, inborn, native human reason. This is sort of specious reason that has been adulterated by false assumptions, false commitments, and so forth. And then you also have some bid'i aqli, innovated rational, and innovated revelation would be inauthentic texts that are passed off as revelation, but that are actually not part of it, such as inauthentic hadith, forged hadith, and so forth, as can be determined through hadith sciences, you know, the sciences of hadith criticism as developed by Muslim hadith scholars and others. And so on some occasions he says, oh, a contradiction is alleged between reason and revelation, but actually this supposed revelation is not even, you know, it's like an inauthentic hadith or something like that, so we don't need to bother with it. But anyway, that's not, the more interesting cases are where, you know, we're talking about clearly authenticated revelation against rational arguments. And so this is sort of the scheme that he tries to bring in place of the traditional scriptural versus rational. It's scripturally validated, which includes both reason and revelation, versus innovative, which also includes both reason and revelation. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share. I think I'm pretty much almost out of time. So this is basically, I mean, that was sort of a kind of closer look, or a sort of closer look at chapter 3 of my book, which is again what the Taharud, according to Ibn Taymiyyah's own presentation of it, is supposed to be all about. I mean, again, he cites this universal law that we read on the very first page of it, and he says this is invalid from a number of angles, and you know he counts actually 44 of them. So he calls them wujuh, which means aspect or something. So al-wajh al-awwal, al-wajh al-thani, all the way to al-wajh al-rabi' wal-arba'un, all the way to 44. And as I said, about 6 of these are really extended disquisitions on a bunch of substantive issues. And so I kind of looked at those in other parts of the book, but chapter 3 itself takes the remaining 38 that you can really say, okay, that's like a direct argument against the universal law itself, the internal coherence of it, the logical coherence of it, the assumptions of it. A lot of those 38 points make, a lot of those 38 arguments cover similar points. So in the book, I try to group them into meaningful sort of categories. And then I say, okay, this set of arguments is meant to kind of achieve this goal. This set of arguments achieves a different goal. And the goals that I could identify them as trying to achieve are the ones that I have shared with you today, these kind of three fundamental moves. This is what in my reading sort of comes out of sort of an inductive reading of these 38 arguments that he makes. And then in chapters 4 and 5, maybe in the Q&A or the discussion, I can get into some of that if people have questions. But chapters 4 and 5, obviously, if we say, okay, reason and revelation seem to be contradicting each other, well, obviously we need to know what is reason and what can be claimed in reason's name. I mean, if you're going to say reason and revelation contradict, well, what does reason say? What is reason and how do we know? So, that's a major point of concern for him. But the other side of the equation is, well, what does revelation say? And how are we supposed to interpret revelation, right? If you're going to claim that reason and revelation contradict, well, how do I know what revelation says? It's not enough to say, well, here's the Quran, it's got 6,236 verses. Great, well, how am I supposed to understand those? There's obviously been, a lot of diversity and disagreement about interpretation of the Quran and of the Hadith. So Ibn Taymiyyah can't really make good on his promise to try to reconcile reason and revelation until he tells us very specifically what reason is and isn't, but also very specifically not so much what revelation is and isn't textually speaking, right? But how are we, to understand and interpret revelation? So he has a lot to say in the Taharud about language in general, the way language functions, human language in general, of which the language of revelation is simply, one use of language, even if it's of a divine origin. I mean, even if the words are coming from God, God is still speaking to human beings in their language, right? And he's using the convention of human language, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah has a lot to say about language as a general phenomenon and how it works, how it conveys meaning. And also he has certain hermeneutical principles about how we should interpret the revelation of the language of the Quran itself. And then chapter 5 goes into some of his critiques of the philosophers and by extension, some of the, especially later mutakallimuns or theologians, assumptions on the level of ontology, also on the level of epistemology, what for him reason consists of, the role of the fitra or kind of inborn sort of native intuition. He actually ascribes a significant role to this, and he goes into that. And then in the last chapter, he kind of, well, I bring all this together and show how this applies to his attempt to solve the question of the divine attributes, and particularly reinterpreting metaphorically attributes, which would seem to imply anthropomorphism, or I like to call it corporealism, because that's really what's at issue here, attributing a body to God. So certain verses of the Quran say, for example, God's hand is above their hands, or his two hands, bal yadahu mabsutatan, his two hands are stretched out. Or when speaking about the creation of Adam, the first human being, God says to Satan, what has prevented you from bowing to what I have created biyadeya, with my two hands, right? So this notion that God has hands. Or Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa, very famous verse, actually several verses that say the same thing, that the All-Merciful, meaning God, has settled upon the throne, right? What does it mean to settle on the throne? Can you do that? Does that mean God has a body? He sits somewhere? What does it mean to settle if you don't have a body? So can we understand verses like this literally? God literally istawa, settled or is established on his throne? Or is this a metaphor for, God has authority over his dominion, for example, or has power over creation, something like that. So all of this, contentious points come up. And of course, groups, theological groups like the Ash'aris, whom Ibn Taymiyyah kind of opposes, they're actually very conservative, if we want to use that word, in the sense that they really only, and also just later Ash'aris, really only propose the metaphorical interpretation of really a handful of attributes that otherwise might seem to imply some type of body or anthropomorphic construal of God or conception of God. The Mu'tazilites have a much more wide-ranging reinterpretation of attributes, and then other groups, go into a purely negative theology where we can't say anything positive about God at all because all of our language and our concepts are all keyed to what we know in the world. And so, if you're going to say, okay, the tree outside my window exists and God exists, well, you're using the same predicate exists for both God and the tree, and that's tashbih. You're assimilating God to creation, and that sort of vitiates God's divinity and so forth. And so we can't affirm anything of God because that would be likening God to creation. And so some groups end up saying what he said, the Botany sort of esotericist, we neither say God exists, nor do we say he doesn't exist, nor do we say God is non-existent, nor do we say he's not non-existent. It's like nothing, you can't say anything. And Ibn Taymiyyah will say, so they fled from trying to, assimilating God to something in his creation, to assimilating to him to that which is completely nonsensical and logically incoherent, and so they sort of, they fled from the fire into the frying pan, or frying pan into the fire, right? They're trying to get away from something and fell into something even worse. And so he tries to kind of dismantle a lot of the, what he sees as some of the philosophical and ontological underpinnings of these types of conclusions, in order to, at the end of the day, and I'll stop here, at the end, to be able to affirm revelation, affirm it in its kind of straightforward sense, which doesn't always mean its purely literal sense, by the way, and this is part of also his kind of theory of language, but in the straightforward, overt sense, also the sense that seems to have been understood by the companions of the Prophet in the first generations of Muslims who didn't in general kind of reinterpret, things like this, certainly not on any kind of substantial scale, but to do so in a way that preserves the uniqueness of God, preserves the divinity of God, preserves the transcendence of God also, and allows God to remain comprehensible to the human mind, because we continue to affirm the attributes that, sort of God affirms of himself in Revelation, is what how Ibn Taymiyyah would put it. But we do so without, risking anthropomorphizing God in our minds. And so that God can remain real and conceivable to us, and therefore that we can have a relationship with him, right? It's not just some abstract idea, but at the same time, we can do so without falling into, blameworthy forms of assimilationism, or anthropomorphization, or anthropomorphism, likening God to his creation, to human beings, or to that which possesses a body, and so forth. Again, it would take several presentations to actually go through each one of those, but what I wanted to do today is just kind of give a general introduction to the Taharud, to Ibn Taymiyyah's project, with a kind of focus on chapter 3 of my own book, and just to give you a foretaste of what you would find in some of the other chapters. Again, the book is available open access, so I can actually put a link for it in the comments, but I'll stop there and open it up for questions or discussions or comments. And again, I thank you for your attention. I hope it was clear, and I apologize if I went slightly over time.